It started with a number that didn't make sense. Not a complicated number. Not a technical one. Just a number that was too big to belong on a piece of paper Eugene Kraft had seen 1,000 times before. On March 14, 2022, a little after sunrise, Eugene stood at the parts counter of the Case IH dealership he had been walking into for most of his adult life. He was 67 years old, and the building smelled exactly the way it always had: oil, rubber, coffee that had been sitting on a warmer too long. The same parts shelves, the same counter, even the same bell on the door that rang when he walked in. But the number printed on the invoice in his hand felt like it belonged to a different place entirely. The hydraulic pump he needed for his Magnum 340 had cost him $340 the last time he bought one. That had been 6 weeks earlier. Same tractor model, same part number, same supplier. Eugene still had the receipt in a drawer at home. Now the screen behind the counter said 1156. Eugene didn't react at first. He just looked at it again. Sometimes when numbers jump that much, there's a mistake somewhere. A wrong digit, a wrong part, a new version of the component. He asked the parts manager to check it again. The man behind the counter didn't look surprised. He typed something, waited a moment, and then turned the screen so Eugene could see it. Same number, same price. Corporate restructuring, he said. Distribution changes. Inventory consolidation. Shipping adjustments. The explanation came out like something he had already said 20 times that week. Eugene listened quietly. He had known this man for years. Watched him grow from a kid stocking shelves to someone running the counter. But today the man didn't make eye contact. Eugene asked a simple question. Was the price going to come back down? The man paused for a moment before answering. I don't know. Eugene folded the invoice once, then again, and slipped it into the pocket of his shirt. He didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't raise his voice. He just nodded once and walked out of the dealership the same way he had walked in thousands of times before. Except this time he left without the part he needed. The drive back to his farm took 15 minutes. Eugene didn't turn on the radio. When he reached the machine shed, he parked his truck and shut off the engine, but stayed in the seat for a while. In front of him sat the Magnum 340, 3 years old, red paint still bright, 1,100 hours on the meter. He had financed it over 7 years at 4.2%, 4 years left on the loan. The hydraulic pump that had just jumped to $1,100 was not optional. Without that pump, the tractor couldn't lift the planter. Without the planter, he couldn't seed 900 acres of corn. And if those 900 acres didn't go into the ground, in the next 5 weeks the year would already be behind before it even started. Eugene sat there thinking about that number again. 1,156. It wasn't that he couldn't pay it. Farmers are used to expensive parts. But something about the jump didn't sit right. Freight costs hadn't tripled in 6 weeks. Steel hadn't tripled in 6 weeks. Nothing in the real world moved that fast. Eugene had been farming long enough to know the difference between something getting expensive and something getting strange. That evening he made a phone call to someone he hadn't spoken with in a while. Darrell Hopper answered on the third ring. Darrell was 74 and had spent 40 years as a mechanic at the same dealership Eugene had just walked out of, back when it was still locally owned, before the buyouts, before the corporate systems. When something broke, Darrell had been the man people trusted to figure it out. He retired a few years earlier, but he hadn't exactly stopped working. Behind his house sat a steel building where tractors still came and went from time to time. When farmers needed something fixed without dealership labor rates attached, Eugene told him about the pump, about the price. Darrell didn't sound shocked. He had been hearing similar stories. Give me a day or two, he said. I'll make a couple calls. 3 days later, Darrell called back. He had found a remanufactured pump from a hydraulic shop in Missouri. Same specs, same flow rate, 6-month warranty, $290. Shipped. Eugene didn't hesitate. He bought it. The following Saturday, he hauled the tractor over to Darrell's shop. The repair took about 4 hours. Nothing complicated. Just bolts, hoses, and a little patience. Eugene paid $200 for the labor and brought lunch from a diner in town. The total bill came to $490. If he had gone through the dealership, it would have been over $1,700 once labor and diagnostics were added. Eugene drove home that afternoon with the tractor working again and more than $1,000 still in his pocket. But the money wasn't what stuck with him. It was the realization that something fundamental had changed. For decades, the dealership had been the first place farmers called when something broke. Not because it was always the cheapest option, but because it was reliable. You paid a little more and you knew the job would get done. But the number on that invoice had crossed a line. A few days later, Eugene mentioned the pump story to his neighbor Russell Voss while they were talking near the edge of a wheat field. Russell farmed about 1,400 acres and ran to Case IH Steiger tractors. Russell had been complaining about parts delays for months, but had assumed it was temporary. Supply chains, pandemic disruptions, inflation. Everyone blamed something different. But when Eugene told him the numbers, Russell went quiet. He asked for Daryl's phone number. 2 weeks later, Russell called Eugene back. One of his tractors needed a DEF injector module. The dealership quoted him $2,340 and said it would take 9 days to arrive from the new National Parts Center in Oklahoma. Russell called Daryl instead. Daryl found a used module from a salvage yard in Nebraska that had come off a tractor totaled in a hailstorm. $680. It arrived in 3 days. Russell installed it that same afternoon. Russell told to other farmers about it. Those 2 farmers told a couple more. At first it was just small conversations. A phone number scribbled on a scrap of paper. Someone mentioning a mechanic who still rebuilt hydraulic valves. Someone else mentioning a salvage yard that shipped overnight. Eugene started paying closer attention to the prices he was hearing from the dealership. A wiring harness that used to cost a little over $100 was now nearly $500. A sensor that once cost under $100 had jumped to almost $400. The explanations posted at the parts counter always sounded the same. Supply chain pressures, freight increases, regulatory compliance costs. Eugene wrote the numbers down anyway. He kept a small notebook in the glove box of his truck. Every time he priced a part at the dealership, he wrote the price on one side of the page. Then he wrote whatever Daryl or someone else managed to find on the other side. By the end of June, there were 23 entries in that notebook. The average difference between the dealership price and the independent source was just over 300%. Eugene showed the notebook to a few farmers during a co-op meeting one evening. Most of them just stared at it quietly. One man, Leonard Gasil, had recently spent over $11,000 replacing a transmission control module on his Magnum 380. He flipped through the pages slowly. Part numbers, prices, names of suppliers. Leonard closed the notebook and asked a question no one in the room had really said out loud before. What would happen if we all just stopped going there? No one answered right away. Because it wasn't really about anger. It wasn't a protest. These were farmers who had bought the same brand of equipment for decades. Some of their fathers had done the same. Walking away from a dealership wasn't something you did lightly. But something about the numbers made the old loyalty feel different. The building was the same. The sign out front was still red. But the decisions that set those prices were being made somewhere far away by people who had probably never seen a corn planter unfold in the morning light. Eugene didn't say much that night. He took the notebook home and set it on the kitchen table. Later he opened it again and looked at the columns of numbers. One price from the dealership, one price from somewhere else. Difference after difference after difference. The next morning he started writing down names. Farmers he knew who ran Case IH equipment. Mechanics who still worked independently. Salvage yards within a few hundred miles. Hydraulic rebuild shops. Electrical specialists. Anyone who might know how to keep a tractor running without going through the dealership system. Eugene wasn't trying to start anything. He wasn't organizing a movement. He was just collecting information. But by the end of that summer, more people had started calling him than he had expected. And slowly, without anyone planning it, the notebook began to matter a lot more than Eugene had ever intended. At first, the notebook didn't look like anything important. Just a cheap spiral pad Eugene had picked up from a hardware store years earlier, grease marks on the cover, corn, dust caught in the edges of the pages. The kind of notebook every farmer ends up with eventually, full of phone numbers, measurements, reminders about seed orders, notes about weather that turned out wrong. But over the next few months the pages started filling with something different. Prices, part numbers, where the part came from, how long it took to arrive, whether it worked, whether it failed. Eugene wasn't trying to build a database. He was just tired of guessing, and the more he wrote down, the clearer the pattern became. The prices coming from the dealership weren't just higher, they were drifting into a different category entirely. Not 20% higher, not even 50%, sometimes to 100%, sometimes 300%. And every time he asked about it, the explanation sounded almost identical. Shipping changes, inventory restructuring, supply chain costs. Words that sounded technical enough to stop most conversations. But Eugene had been farming long enough to know that real life costs don't jump that fast all at once unless something else is happening underneath. By midsummer, the notebook had stopped being something he kept to himself. Farmers talk. Always. Have. Most conversations start simple. A question about rainfall. A comment about fertilizer prices. Someone mentioning a part that took too long to arrive. And once the subject of parts came up, Eugene would pull the notebook out of his truck and show the numbers. Usually the reaction was the same. At first the other farmer would lean in, curious. Then he'd start flipping pages. Then he'd go quiet. Because once you saw 20 or 30 examples lined up in a row, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon in July, Eugene was sitting on the tailgate of his truck at the co-op grain elevator when a farmer named Clay Winters asked if the notebook really showed the full difference. Eugene nodded and turned it around so Clay could see. Clay pointed to one entry near the middle of the page. Fuel injector assembly. Dealer price, $1. For 180, independent supplier. For $110. Clay shook his head slowly. I thought I was the only one getting hit like that, he said. Eugene told him he wasn't. Not even close. By August, the calls started coming more often. Some were quick questions. Others turned into long conversations about equipment that used to be easy to maintain, but now required diagnostic computers and dealership authorization codes. One man said he had waited 11 days for a sensor that used to sit on a shelf 10 miles away. Another said a repair that should have taken an afternoon turned into a 2-week delay because the dealership needed software clearance before installing the part. The more stories Eugene heard, the more he realized something had shifted. In the way the system worked, the dealership itself hadn't changed much on the surface. Same building, same staff, same sign out front. But the decisions that controlled parts and prices no longer happened there. They happened somewhere else entirely. The explanation finally became clearer when one of the parts managers mentioned something during a conversation that fall. Case. IH's parent company, C&H Industrial, had consolidated its parts distribution network. 12 regional warehouses across the Midwest had been closed. Inventory that used to sit within driving distance of farms was now routed through a single, automated fulfillment center in Oklahoma. The company had announced the move as a modernization effort. Faster processing, better efficiency, smarter logistics. But what it meant in practice was that every single part now traveled through a longer chain before it reached a farmer. More handling, more processing, more fees attached at every step. And one rule in particular stood out when Eugene heard about it. Any part categorized as critical was automatically processed through an expedited handling system. The customer didn't choose the option. It was mandatory. Hydraulic components, electrical modules, emission sensors. Most of the parts that actually stopped a tractor from working were now classified that way, which meant every time a farmer ordered one of those parts, the system quietly added a fee that often pushed the final price far beyond what it used to be. When Eugene wrote those details down in the notebook, something about the situation finally made sense. The dealership wasn't really setting the prices anymore. The system was. Algorithms deciding shipping priority. Automated warehouses deciding routing paths. Handling fees applied before a human employee ever saw the order. The parts manager who stood behind the counter wasn't the one controlling the numbers. He was just the one who had to explain them. Eugene kept writing anyway, page after page. By September, the notebook had grown thick enough that the original spiral binding started bending slightly. He began adding phone numbers in the margins. Independent mechanics, hydraulic rebuilders, salvage yards that specialized in tractors damaged by storms, or insurance write-offs. Most of these businesses had existed for years, but farmers hadn't relied on them heavily because the dealership system had always been simpler. Now those same shops were suddenly getting more calls. One Saturday morning, Eugene stopped by Darrell Hopper's shop to drop off a hydraulic cylinder that needed resealing. The steel building behind Darrell's house looked busier than usual. Two tractors sat outside waiting for repairs. Inside, parts were spread across workbenches the way they had been when Darrell worked at the dealership decades earlier. Eugene asked if business had picked up. Darrell wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "A lot more calls lately," he said. "Mostly the same question. Can you find the part cheaper than the dealer?" Eugene smiled slightly. That question had become familiar. Word traveled quickly in rural communities, even without anyone trying to organize anything. By the time harvest season began, Eugene's notebook had started circulating beyond the handful of farmers who had originally seen it. Someone would borrow it for a day and show it to a neighbor. Then the neighbor would call Eugene and ask where he had found a particular supplier. Eugene never charged anyone for the information. He wasn't selling anything. He was simply sharing what he had learned by accident. But the effect was larger than he expected. One evening in early October, he received a call from Leonard Gazille, the farmer who had asked that question at the co-op meeting weeks earlier. Leonard said he had been thinking about something Eugene showed him, the numbers in the notebook, the pattern behind them. Leonard had called several of the suppliers Eugene listed and confirmed the same differences. Sometimes the dealer price was nearly triple. Leonard paused for a moment before continuing. Then he said something that stayed with Eugene long after the call ended. "If those prices keep going the way they are," he said, "we're not really buying equipment anymore. We're renting the ability to keep it running." Eugene didn't answer right away, because deep down he knew Leonard was probably right. The tractors themselves were already expensive enough when farmers signed the loan papers. But the real cost of ownership showed up years later through maintenance, parts, repairs, software updates. Every system designed to keep the machines running had slowly become more centralized and more controlled. And when control moves far away from the people using the equipment, prices tend to follow it. By the end of that fall, the notebook contained more than 50 entries. It had stopped looking like a simple record and started looking more like a map, a rough outline of how farmers were quietly finding ways around a system that had grown too expensive to rely on. Eugene still didn't think of it as anything important. To him, it was just information. But information spreads, and once people begin comparing numbers, the story those numbers tell becomes difficult to ignore. The first real sign that something bigger was happening came near the start of winter. Eugene stopped by the dealership one afternoon to pick up a set of filters. The parking lot looked slightly emptier than usual. Inside, the parts counter had fewer customers waiting. The parts manager who rang up Eugene's order mentioned casually that service appointments had slowed down compared to the previous year. Eugene didn't comment. He paid for the filters and left. But as he drove back toward his farm, he couldn't help noticing how many tractors were sitting in machine sheds across the countryside that season. Machines that farmers were fixing themselves, machines being repaired in small workshops instead of dealership service bays. And somewhere in the middle of all those quiet decisions sat a grease-stained notebook in the glove box of Eugene Kraft's truck, slowly turning into something much bigger than he ever intended. By the time winter settled over the Kansas fields that year, Eugene Kraft had stopped thinking of the notebook as just a record of prices. It had become something else without him really noticing. When the shift happened, at first it was just numbers, then it was numbers with phone numbers beside them. Then it was numbers, suppliers, mechanics, shipping times. and little notes scribbled in the margins about whether a repair worked or didn't. But sometime around late November, the notebook stopped being something Eugene checked occasionally and started becoming something other people asked about. The calls were still simple at first. A farmer from the next county asking if the hydraulic shop in Missouri still had pumps available. Another asking if the salvage yard in Nebraska shipped sensors overnight. Sometimes the calls came during the day while Eugene was working in the shed. Sometimes late at night when someone had a machine down. And planting schedules didn't leave much room for waiting. Eugene answered when he could and wrote down whatever new information he learned. It wasn't organized in any professional way. No spreadsheets yet. No system beyond what made sense to him. But slowly the notebook began filling with something farmers hadn't shared with each other in years: reliable alternatives. Around that same time, the dealership system kept drifting further away from the way it used to work. Farmers noticed it in small ways first. Parts that used to sit on shelves were now almost always listed as in transit. Orders that once arrived in 2 days now took a week or more. When parts did arrive, the invoices often included charges no one remembered seeing before. Handling fees, expedited processing, inventory adjustments. Most farmers didn't argue about the details. They simply paid the bill because the machine had to run, and there was rarely another option when a planter or combine was sitting idle in the middle of a season. But that assumption that there was no other option was starting to change quietly. One afternoon in December, Eugene drove out to Darrell Hopper's shop again. Snow from the previous week still sat along the edges of the gravel driveway. Inside the steel building, the tractors were parked side by side, with their side panels removed. Darrell stood over a workbench sorting through electrical connectors. Eugene noticed a third machine waiting outside. That was more than usual for winter. "Looks like you're staying busy," Eugene said. Darrell shrugged slightly and kept working. "People are calling more," he said. "A lot more, mostly the same thing. They ask if I can fix it without the dealership software." Eugene knew what that meant. Modern tractors weren't just engines and hydraulics anymore. They were computers on wheels. Sensors feeding information to control modules. Control modules locked behind diagnostic programs that manufacturers guarded carefully. For years, farmers had accepted that arrangement because the dealership network handled the technical side of those repairs, but the prices tied to that system had started pushing people to reconsider what they were willing to depend on. Darrell reached under the workbench and pulled out a small laptop with a worn keyboard. A friend of his had helped him install diagnostic software that could read most Case IH systems without going through the dealership network. It wasn't something the manufacturers officially approved of, but it worked well enough to reset codes and diagnose common faults. That little laptop had become one of the most requested tools in the shop. Eugene watched as Darrell plugged the computer into one of the tractors and waited while the system scanned through its data. 5 years ago, farmers wouldn't have bothered with this, Darrell said without looking up. They'd just haul the machine to the dealer. Eugene nodded slowly. That was true. But 5 years ago, a simple sensor replacement didn't cost 4 times what it used to. As winter moved deeper into January, the notebook kept expanding. Eugene started carrying it into meetings at the local co-op and sometimes leaving it on the table for others to flip through. The reaction was always similar: curiosity first, then surprise, then long quiet moments while people processed what the numbers actually meant. One evening, a younger farmer named Marcus Treadwell showed up at one of those meetings. Marcus was in his early 30s and had recently taken over most of his family's land. After his father retired, he still believed in buying new equipment when possible because new machines meant fewer breakdowns and more predictable seasons. Marcus listened while the older farmers talked about parts, prices, and supply delays. When Eugene eventually slid the notebook across the table, Marcus opened it and began reading through the entries carefully, page after page of comparisons: dealer, price, independent price, shipping time, sometimes even notes about who installed the part. Marcus didn't say much at first. Then he pointed at one entry halfway down the page: fuel filter assembly, dealer price just over $1,200, independent supplier to $110. That can't be the same part, Marcus said. Eugene leaned forward and tapped the part number written in the margin. Same manufacturer, same specifications, only difference was the color of the paint on the casing. Marcus closed the notebook slowly. No one in the room spoke for a few seconds, because the numbers weren't really about filters or pumps anymore. They were about control, who had it, who didn't, and how much it cost to work outside of it. Around that same time, something unexpected started happening across the 4 counties. Surrounding Eugene's farm, independent mechanics who had been semi-retired were suddenly getting calls again. Small hydraulic shops that used to rebuild cylinders occasionally were now booking weeks in advance. Salvage yards that specialized in damaged agricultural equipment were shipping parts to farms that had never contacted them before. None of this was coordinated. No meetings, no formal group. Just farmers quietly sharing information with each other the way they always had when something important changed. Eugene didn't think of himself as leading any of it. Most days he was still focused on the same work he had done for decades. Maintaining equipment, watching the weather, planning the next planting season. But the notebook kept traveling further than he expected. By February of 2023, it had been copied into a simple spreadsheet that several farmers passed around by email. The format was basic but effective. Columns listing part numbers, dealership quotes, alternative suppliers, and contact information for mechanics who could install them. Every few weeks, someone added another entry, then another. The list slowly expanded beyond the original 23 examples Eugene had written down months earlier. One afternoon, he received a call from a farmer nearly 100 miles away who said he had been given Eugene's name by a neighbor. The man needed a wiring harness for a Magnum tractor, and the dealership quote was nearly $500. Eugene flipped through the notebook and gave him the phone number of a supplier in Iowa who sold the same harness for under $150. The man paused for a moment after writing the number down. Then he asked a question Eugene had begun hearing more often. How many people are using this list now? Eugene thought about it for a second. Hard to say exactly, he answered, but more than a few, and the number kept growing. What started as a single notebook in the glove box of one farmer's truck was slowly turning into something larger than anyone involved had planned. Not a protest, not an organization, just a quiet exchange of information between people who understood that if the system controlling their equipment kept moving further away from them, they would eventually have to move away from the system instead. Eugene didn't talk about it much outside those circles, but late one evening in early spring, he sat at his kitchen table flipping through the notebook. Again, the pages were nearly full now, the spiral binding bent slightly from use. Across those pages were dozens of names, suppliers, mechanics, and numbers that told a story most people outside farming would never notice. It was the story of how a system designed to make things more efficient had slowly made them harder for the people who depended on it the most. And it was also the beginning of something else, because once farmers realized they had options, even imperfect ones, they stopped assuming the dealership was the only place to turn when something broke. And that quiet shift was only just beginning. The shift didn't happen all at once. That was the strange part. No announcement, no meeting, no moment when anyone stood up and said the rules had changed. Instead, it crept in through small stories that started sounding more and more alike. By the spring of 2023, the spreadsheet that had grown out of Eugene Kraft's notebook was circulating quietly across several counties. No logo, no organization, just a plain document with columns of part numbers, dealer quotes, alternative suppliers, and the names of mechanics willing to work outside the dealership network. At first, it had been shared between a handful of farmers who knew each other well enough to trust the information. But farmers talk, and information that saves money tends to travel fast. Every few weeks, a new entry appeared. A new hydraulic shop someone had found. A salvage yard in another state willing to ship overnight. A mechanic who had figured out how to bypass a stubborn diagnostic code. None of it was dramatic, just practical solutions to problems that used to be solved automatically by the dealership system. But as the list grew, something else began happening that no one had predicted. The dealerships started noticing the silence. Service appointments slowed. Parts orders dropped. Equipment that normally would have been hauled into dealership bays stayed in farm shops instead. In March of that year, Eugene received a call from someone he hadn't expected to hear from. Todd Ehrlich, the service manager at the same dealership. Eugene had walked out of the year before, asked if Eugene had a few minutes to talk. Todd had worked at that dealership for nearly 2 decades. He knew most of the farmers in the region by name. When Eugene answered the phone, Todd didn't sound angry. If anything, he sounded tired. He said something that surprised Eugene. Parts and service revenue had dropped nearly 70% compared to the previous year. At first, the dealership management assumed it was temporary. Maybe farmers were delaying repairs because commodity prices had fluctuated. Maybe the season had simply been slower. But the numbers kept moving in the same direction month after month. Eugene listened quietly while Todd explained the situation. Todd didn't accuse him of anything. In fact, he seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Farmers were finding other ways to keep their equipment running. Eugene finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind for months. Has corporate said anything about adjusting the prices? Todd let out a short breath before answering. Not that I've heard. The company still believed the new distribution system was more efficient. Centralized warehouses meant lower operating costs. Automated logistics meant faster order processing. On paper, the changes looked successful. Revenue per parts transaction had actually increased because the new pricing structure added mandatory handling fees and expedited shipping to most orders. From a corporate perspective, the system was performing exactly the way it was designed to. But numbers on a corporate report didn't show what was happening in machine sheds. Across the countryside, they didn't show the independent mechanics, whose schedules were suddenly booked weeks in advance. They didn't show the hydraulic rebuild shops shipping components across state lines. And they certainly didn't show the growing spreadsheet quietly circulating among farmers, who had stopped believing the dealership network was the only place to turn when something broke. Todd eventually admitted something else during that call. The dealership had started discussing staff reductions if the trend continued through the year. Eugene didn't know what to say to that. Todd had always treated farmers fairly when machines came in for repairs. But the decisions that created the problem weren't being made at the dealership level anymore. They were coming from offices hundreds of miles away. For a while, the conversation drifted into silence before Todd changed the subject. He asked Eugene a question that felt both simple and complicated at the same time. Do you think farmers will come back? Eugene looked out the window of his kitchen while he considered the answer. Fields still covered in the early green of spring planting stretched out beyond the house. Finally, he said something that sounded almost like an apology. I think people will do whatever they have to in order to keep farming. When the call ended, Eugene sat there for a few minutes thinking about how quickly things had changed. Less than a year earlier, the idea of farmers avoiding dealership service altogether would have sounded unrealistic. Those dealerships had been part of the local economy for decades. But when the cost of staying inside a system rises faster than the cost of leaving it, people eventually start stepping outside. Over the following months, the quiet shift accelerated. Farmers who once relied on dealership technicians began investing in diagnostic laptops that independent mechanics recommended. Some of the software circulating online wasn't officially authorized, but it allowed farmers to read fault codes, reset systems, and run basic diagnostics without paying a service call fee. Every time a warning light appeared, salvage yards that specialized in damaged agricultural equipment reported a noticeable increase in demand. Tractors written off after hailstorms or accidents were suddenly valuable sources of sensors, modules, and electronic components that dealerships sold at several times the price. Even parts that looked proprietary often turned out to be manufactured by the same suppliers, who produced equivalent components under different brand names. One farmer discovered that a fuel filter assembly sold under the Case IH label for more than $1,000 was functionally identical to a Fleet Guard unit that cost just over $100. Once those kinds of discoveries started appearing in the spreadsheet, they spread quickly. But the most dramatic turning point came in early September of 2023, when a farmer named Glenn Portman called Eugene late one evening. Glenn was 54 and had purchased a new Magnum 310 tractor earlier that spring. The machine was still under warranty. A few weeks earlier, Glenn had replaced a faulty pressure sensor himself, using an aftermarket component that cost $90 instead of waiting 9 days and paying more than $600 for the dealership to install the official version. At the time, the decision seemed practical. The tractor worked normally afterward, and Glenn went back to his harvest schedule without thinking much about it. Then a letter arrived from the manufacturer. The tractor's telematics system had recorded the change in sensor data according to the warranty terms. Installing an unauthorized part counted as tampering with the emissions control system. The company informed Glenn that the powertrain warranty on his tractor had been voided. He still had 2 years and nearly 1,800 operating hours remaining under that warranty. When Glenn finished explaining what had happened, there was a long silence on the phone. Eugene finally asked if Glenn planned to challenge the decision. Glenn answered calmly, "No, I'm just letting everyone know what they're willing to do." The story spread across the same quiet network that had been sharing parts suppliers and repair tips. For many farmers, the letter Glenn received confirmed something they had been slowly realizing for months. The warranty that came with modern equipment wasn't simply protection anymore. It was leverage. If you repaired the machine your own way, you risked losing the coverage entirely. And if the machine itself reported every change back to the manufacturer, the system had a way of enforcing that control even when no dealership technician was involved. That realization changed the conversation across Eugene's network almost overnight. Up until then, many farmers assumed they could continue buying new tractors as long as they waited until the warranty period ended before handling repairs independently. Glenn's situation made it clear that even basic maintenance choices could trigger consequences inside that system, which meant farmers faced a new question that had nothing to do with horsepower or fuel efficiency. Was the protection offered by a warranty still worth the restrictions that came with it? By the time the fall harvest season ended, several farmers in Eugene's growing network had already started making a different kind of calculation. Instead of trading in older tractors for new ones, they began searching farm auctions for machines a few years older, whose warranties had already expired. The reasoning was simple. A used tractor might lack the newest technology, but it also came without the electronic leash that tied newer equipment back to the manufacturer. Eugene watched this shift happening gradually across the region. Machines that once would have been replaced every few years were staying in service longer. Mechanics like Daryl Hopper were busier than ever rebuilding systems that dealerships used to replace entirely. And somewhere in the background, the spreadsheet continued growing, quietly connecting farmers who had begun learning how to operate outside a system that had slowly become too expensive to trust completely. What none of them realized yet was how much further that shift would go before the year was over. By the beginning of 2024, the change was no longer subtle. For most of the previous year, the shift had happened quietly. One farmer here, another there, someone choosing to fix a tractor in their own shed instead of hauling it to the dealership. But by winter, the pattern was clear enough that even people outside the network Eugene Kraft had stumbled into could see it happening. Fewer trucks were pulling into dealership service bays. Parts counters that used to have farmers waiting in line now stayed quiet for long stretches of the day. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens when dozens of people make the same decision privately, and no one announces it out loud. Eugene noticed it the next time he drove past the dealership on the highway outside town. For decades, the front lot had been crowded with new equipment. Tractors lined up in neat rows, combines parked beside them, planters folded up like enormous metal wings. That winter, the lot looked thinner. Machines still sat there, but not as many. The empty spaces between them made the place feel different. Eugene didn't stop. For 43 years, he had pulled into that parking lot whenever something broke or wore out. But since the day he folded that invoice and put it in his shirt pocket, he hadn't gone back inside, unless he needed something simple like filters. Most of the time, he didn't even think about it anymore. His tractors were running. That was what mattered. The two Magnum machines in his shed were both either paid off or nearly paid off now. One was the 2019 Magnum 340 he had fixed with Darrell Hopper's help. The other was a 2018 Magnum he had purchased at an auction the previous fall, after canceling an order for a brand new model. That decision had surprised a few people who knew Eugene. For years he had traded equipment regularly like most farmers in the region. The dealership salesman had already prepared financing paperwork for the new tractor Eugene planned to buy in October of 2023. But after hearing Glenn Portman's warranty story, Eugene made a quiet phone call and canceled the deal. The salesman had asked if something was wrong with the price. Eugene told him no. The salesman asked if Eugene was looking at another brand. Eugene told him no again. The truth was simpler than either explanation. Eugene had realized that the most valuable thing a tractor offered wasn't the warranty attached to it. It was the freedom to repair it without asking permission. The used Magnum he eventually bought at auction had less than 900 hours on it and cost nearly $140,000 less than the new machine he had originally planned to purchase. It arrived on a flatbed truck late one afternoon, and Eugene spent the next weekend going through every major system with Darrell's help. They replaced a few hoses, rebuilt one hydraulic valve, and updated a handful of sensors. The total repair bill came to less than $500. After that, the tractor ran perfectly. Word of decisions like Eugene's traveled through the same quiet network that had grown out of the old notebook. By the end of that winter, more than a dozen farmers in the region had chosen to stop buying new equipment entirely. Instead, they searched auctions and private sales for machines old enough to operate outside manufacturer warranty systems, but new enough to remain efficient in the field. Some farmers switched brands. Others stayed with Case but refused to rely on dealership service anymore. None of these choices were coordinated. They were simply practical decisions made by people who had spent their lives calculating risk. From the perspective of CNH Industrial's corporate offices, the numbers looked different. Revenue per parts transaction had increased dramatically since the distribution network was centralized. Profit margins on service contracts were higher than they had been in years. The logistics system that routed parts through the fulfillment center in Oklahoma operated exactly the way engineers had designed it to. Every shipment tracked, every handling fee applied automatically, every transaction recorded neatly and quarterly. Reports. On paper, the modernization program appeared to be working. But paper rarely tells the whole story in agriculture. It doesn't show the tractors sitting in machine sheds while independent mechanics rebuild components that dealerships once replaced entirely. It doesn't show the laptops farmers now keep in toolboxes so they can read diagnostic codes themselves instead of paying for service calls. And it certainly doesn't show the dozens of quiet conversations happening between neighbors about how to keep equipment running without depending on a system that had become too expensive to trust completely. In February of 2024, Eugene received another unexpected phone call. This time, it was Todd Ehrlich again, the service manager who had spoken with him months earlier. Todd's voice sounded different now. The dealership had gone through staff reductions. During the winter, several technicians had been laid off. Parts and service hours had been reduced to 4 days a week. Todd himself had been let go after 19 years with the company. He wasn't calling to complain. He simply asked Eugene if he knew of any shops hiring mechanics. Eugene thought for a moment and then gave him Darrell Hopper's number. 2 weeks later, Todd started working in Darrell's steel building outside town, doing the same repairs he had once performed inside the dealership service bays. The difference was that farmers who brought their tractors there no longer had to drive through a gate controlled by a corporate service schedule. They just called ahead and showed up when Darrell had space. By the time spring planting approached again, the network that had begun with Eugene's notebook had grown to more than 120 farmers spread across several counties. It still had no name, no meetings, no membership cards, just a shared understanding that the system surrounding modern farm equipment had changed, and farmers needed to adapt with it. Some still bought new machines when the numbers made sense. Others relied on older equipment they could repair themselves. but nearly all of them had stopped assuming the dealership would always be their first call. When something failed, one warm afternoon in June, Eugene stood in his machine shed rebuilding a hydraulic cylinder. When a pickup truck pulled into the driveway, the driver was Marcus Treadwell, the younger farmer who had studied the notebook months earlier at the co-op meeting. Marcus climbed out and walked into the shed, glancing around at the tractors and tools scattered across the workbench. He said he had recently bought his first brand new Magnum tractor and wanted advice about maintaining it. Eugene wiped his hands on a rag and listened while Marcus explained the loan terms and the long list of features built into the machine. Marcus sounded proud, the way most people do when they invest in something important. When he finished speaking, Eugene didn't lecture him about prices or corporate policies. Instead, he walked over to the workbench and pulled out the notebook that had started everything. 2 years earlier, the cover was worn now, pages bent from being flipped through so many times. Eugene placed it in Marcus's hands and said something simple. "This is what it costs to keep one of these running if you follow the system exactly the way they want you to." Then he pointed to the second column of numbers beside it. "And this is what it costs if you learn how to do it another way." Marcus stood there for a long moment reading the entries. He didn't say much. Eventually he closed the notebook and thanked Eugene for letting him see it. As he walked back toward his truck, Eugene returned to the hydraulic cylinder on the workbench. He didn't know whether Marcus would ever look at those numbers again or whether the younger farmer would simply continue doing things the traditional way. But 3 months later, Marcus called asking for the phone number of a supplier who sold fuel filter assemblies cheaper than the dealership. Eugene gave him the number without saying anything else. That made 129 farmers now, quietly sharing information across the same network. Late that summer, Eugene drove past the dealership again on his way back from town. The building still stood where it always had. The red sign was still mounted above the entrance, but the parking lot looked mostly empty that afternoon. Eugene slowed slightly as he passed the entrance, but didn't turn in. For 43 years, that dealership had been part of how he farmed. It had been a place where people knew his name and the machines he ran, a place where help was supposed to be waiting when something broke. But somewhere along the way, the relationship had changed into something else. The people in the building hadn't necessarily changed. The system around them had. Eugene drove on toward his farm without stopping. The tractors waiting in his shed were running fine. That was enough. And when younger farmers asked him what advice he had about buying modern equipment, Eugene usually told them the same quiet truth he had discovered 2 years earlier while staring at an invoice that didn't make sense. You can do it their way if you want. Just remember that every year the cost of doing it their way gets a little higher, and sooner or later you might run out of years before you run out of debt.